Revolutionary greetings. This is Victor Coronado alongside Carlos Cruz Mosquera and Nick Ayala. We're Anti-Conquista. We have three guests with us today: Justin Jimenez, Carlito Rovira, Forever a Young Lord, and Pambana, who's in Havana. Justin Jimenez is also in Havana. He's with Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective. How's everybody doing? Good. So let's get right into it. So on July 11th, Sunday, July 11th, an online campaign titled hashtag SOS Cuba was waged against Cuba, causing protests in the streets of Havana and other cities in Cuba. Here's Pambana coming on. Justin, you can hear us? Okay, good. So let's talk about SOS Cuba. Where did it come from? What took place on Sunday? Specifically, Justin, Justin and Pambana specifically, you folks are there in Havana now. From your perspective, what was happening on the ground and what are you hearing?
Yeah, I guess I can start. I think with the last few months, the last couple of years have really led to an additional straining of the situation on the ground. When you think about access to food and shortages of basic items, when you think about the transportation situation, the energy situation, when you think about how COVID-19 has impacted the situation on the ground. So I think there are these frustrations by the condition, and you can't really talk about the condition. We're talking about how the blockade was strengthened in the last couple of years with about 100 of Trump's 243 additional sanctions of the blockade being added during the pandemic. Everything from the sanctioning of Western Union, which impeded people from sending remittances, to very specific, rules about places where tourists can't stay, which takes money, out of the government, which then takes money out of their response to the pandemic. So I think things have become, a lot more difficult on the ground, and that's a lot of the underlying frustration that we saw in the protests on Sunday. And when you talk about the SOS Cuba, I think that's something that a lot of research and investigation is being done on right now. But I think there's a lot of, confirmed irregular patterns in terms of how it's spread across social media, in terms of how quickly it was picked up by the U.S. media, and, how, the language that's being used in sort of analyzing it and reading it by the U.S. media and Congress, and the president in responding to it. So again, like a lot of regular patterns in the way it's been used, in the way that the underlying frustration at these daily shortages, these daily challenges are being weaponized, by U.S. media. I don't think it's a coincidence at all that this is happening at the same time as Biden and his administration were undergoing their policy review, which has been much delayed. So I'd say that's what I have to say about that right now.
Pambana, can you hear us? Are you good? She looks like she's frozen.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah. Carlito, talk to me. SOS Cuba. What's going on?
SOS Cuba is like USA, another creation, another masterpiece of the CIA. There's a lot of ways to analyze the present crisis. Okay. If the sister comes back on, why don't you give her the floor? Okay.
Absolutely.
And I'll pause. It has been a test that is twofold. Okay. Not just one-sided. It's not just an attempt to wage psychological warfare against Cuba. It's not just a way of looking at the possibilities for a U.S. military intervention in Cuba. It's also a way, sister, are you back?
Pambana, can you hear us?
the sound's not that great, so I'm gonna try type into her everything that's going on, and then
Okay.
she can respond. That way she can hear us. So I'll let her know.
But it's also a way to explore, for the U.S. rulers to explore how much solidarity does Cuba have in the United States. Okay. It's also a way to entrench the American psychology deeper into the propaganda, into the imperialist propaganda. So it's not one-sided. The offensive is not just one-sided. It's two-sided. And this is something that the rulers have learned since Vietnam. Okay. Of course, they were launching propaganda to the Vietnamese people, but they were also doing propaganda to the American people, and that's where their flaws, that's where their weakness came. And since Vietnam, they have tried to learn from that and to step up their game.
I'll just come in with that, and hopefully, as you guys can tell, Pambana and Justin, well, particularly Pambana right now is having difficulties with her connection, and again, it goes back to the situation in Cuba and the internet connection and stuff has to do also with the blockade, with the with the sanctions and the underdevelopment of technology in Cuba because of it. But Justin, I just wanted to know, since you're on the ground, we see on social media a lot of propaganda. There are viral posts talking about famine in Cuba, talking about hundreds or if not thousands of people dying of a supposed famine, which anybody who can use Google will know that not even right-wing media are saying this. But yeah, so we would just like to know what's it like on the ground, particularly in terms of food. What's it like for regular working class Cubans in terms of accessing food, and particularly for Black Cubans as well, which for us it's important to know oppressed communities, particularly Black people. What's it like for a Black Cuban in terms of accessing food, accessing healthcare, and just general life?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just starting from a general overview, I think now compared to other times that I've been on the ground, it's definitely factually a harder situation when it comes to accessing food. I think it just goes from what Cuba's able to buy on the international markets right now. Given the situation with it being placed on the list of state-sponsored terrorism, which impacts its transnational banking relations, and just given what it's able to bring into the country. So there are things that are harder to find. I think on the ground you see very long lines for people looking for specific things. For example, chicken is one of the things that we have seen shortages of. That you often see these long lines of people trying to get. I think from our experience right now, it's you constantly you really have to be on top of who's selling or reselling something that you might not be able to find somewhere else, like chicken or fish or beans. I think going with the the things that are that are grown here, it's very seasonal. So right before this we were coming out of tomato season, so tomatoes were very easy to find, but right now they might not be as easy to find. And then I would say to your question of a working class Cuban or a Black working class Cuban, I think those are where the shortages are especially felt. I think you think of people who may have fewer people that they know on the outside, fewer people in the conservative exile community, who are able to send money, right now through like a third means. There have been these services that are set up that take a big chunk of the percentage of money that people are trying to send, and they'll come on charter flights that have been set up in lieu of not being able to send remittances through the Western Union. But I think that's where it's mostly felt in terms of, you know, the money that people have, you know, not going far enough to meet all of their needs, you know, just because of what the situation is again on the ground, you know, because of some of the inflation that's happened due to there being shortages, due to the government trying to capture as many dollars as it can, until recently when it decided that wasn't a viable path anymore. And, you know, in terms of what the government's done, there have been some attempts to remedy that. Specifically, you know, a lot of fines were put into place for people that, you know, were inflating the prices of basic goods. So again, you know, basic vegetables, to really help remedy that. But, you know, there have been shortages, and I think the places where it's mostly felt is working class Cubans, it's Black Cubans, and it's people who may not have as much access to, you know, to dollars or remittances from outside. You know, again, those remittances are coming now into the country through third-party means.
Thanks for that, Justin. And you know, just to kind of further a little bit on those points. Again, because on social media we're seeing like things like you know, people are dying of hunger, people are dying of starvation. We understand that the situation in Cuba is difficult, as you're telling us, Justin. But are there people dying of hunger in Cuba at the moment?
Yeah.
Hey, greetings. I'm not sure if you, yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if you all can hear me. Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Thank you for the focus primarily on Black working class. That is the majority of Cuba, Caribbean island that's made up of people who are of African diaspora, African descendants, majority Black, Afro-Cuban, you know, however people identify themselves. This is decidedly a Caribbean country, and the Cuban revolutionary process is decidedly one that is anti-slavery, that's anti-colonial, anti-apartheid, and in pro of the working classes and the campesinos, the majority. So as Justin was saying, what I caught, not only does the blockade have really intersectional or you know, impacts that target primarily the majorities, working class people, gendered impacts, racialized impacts. These sanctions are targeted particularly at an economy that's based primarily on ensuring that people's basic needs are met and are provided by that shared budget and centrally organized economy. But also, you know, all of the ways in which we are navigating, you know, living in a world after 500 years of colonialism. So the blockade has its impacts, and as does colonialism and the history of Cuba being just totally riddled with plantations and enslavement and genocide by European imperialism and by US imperialism. You know, Cuba was a neo-colony of the US before it, you know, fought off those shackles in 1959 and, you know, move forward with a struggle that would support Black internationalism and anti-colonial struggles. So all of that to say, people are, I would say those are unconfirmed reports that people are dying of hunger. It seems unlikely. You know, people are also not dying as much of COVID. You know, I'm not sure. I've heard some of your work. You have folks in the Bronx. You know, New York, they just reported that 35,000 people have died from COVID. In Los Angeles, that has the same, I think the county has 11 million people. Cuba has about 11 million people. In Los Angeles, it's something like over 20,000 people have died. And we all know those impacts have been targeted specifically at essential workers, at the majorities of Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks. So here in Cuba, Black folks are not dying from COVID the way they are in the US. And certainly Black people are not dying from hunger. I mean, from my house, you know, you walk, you see agros, which are like vegetable stands. There are mercados where people can buy food items. In Cuba, with the centralized economy, food is deeply subsidized. People also have libretas or ration cards to access prices that are at a subsidized rate. And then also there are, smaller businesses that are either semi-governmental or private, where people can buy food items. And then folks have heard about the MLC stores. So those are the stores where you buy things in US currency on a card. And those are the harder to reach places because of the ways in which, colonialism is a racialized project, and also, who has left the island and is sending money back home, and then who is funded by the USAID and right-wing fascist interests in Miami. But to dispel that, I couldn't completely say I'm in Havana, I'm not in all of the provinces, I'm not in rural areas, but I've seen a commitment to saving lives when it comes to COVID over business, over profit, and certainly to pursuing economic measures that would ensure that people can access their basic needs. But things are really difficult because of all of the sanctions that Justin mentioned, and the difficulty, for all of the global South with the global North's hoarding.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think the thing that is having the most impact, I think, is access to medicine. While COVID-19, in terms of the response, it's been a really incredible response, both in the country and internationally, in terms of Cuba's commitment to medical internationalism. I think the challenge has been people who may have a pre-existing condition not being able to access medicines that they would receive before, due to the shortages. And I think often with the SOS Cuba campaign, in terms of one of the many misinformation pieces in there, I think it's a misunderstanding of how the infrastructure works. So people have been saying, we should send all of the doctors to Cuba, not understanding that, the trained medical professionals are here. In terms of the response to the recent crisis in Matanzas, where there's been a really big spread of COVID-19, mostly due in part to the Delta variant that's, made its landfall here. They've graduated medical students early to respond to the crisis. They've recalled doctors who are in international brigades to help with the crisis. So, the trained medical professionals, the medical system, is very set up to deal with these challenges. It's more of like, the blockade actually stripping them of all of the tools they need to respond. We see that in the case of, two events that happened during the pandemic. One, which was Cuba was in line to buy, a few ventilators from a Swiss company. And then from one day to the other, it was bought by a US company, and through the Helms-Burton Act, that meant that then that deal was they could no longer buy them. And their way to respond to that was to use an open plan from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to develop their own ventilators. So just really to show like how far the medical system is willing to go here to ensure that its people are cared for and are safe. And additionally, they were set to receive a plenty of donations, which many other countries received, but from Chinese billionaire Jack Ma. And that was something that was also, blocked in terms of, aid that other countries have received. So, just making that clear. So I think really what's happened is a lot of people that would receive medicines, that may be hard to access here, on like a typical schedule where people would bring it to them every few months. They've had that disrupted. Just this morning, I was talking to a professor of mine, for example, who has nerve damage in her back. And she needs these very specific shots that she hasn't been able to find here. So, someone from outside would be able to bring it for her, or they could find an alternative here. But right now, all the alternatives that they're making are being used for the fight against COVID-19. So in order for her to find something that works in the meantime, she's gotten similar medication from a friend she knows who has cancer. So just to really show that picture of how the blockade impacts people's really daily health regimens, especially if you have a pre-existing condition.
Yes, Justin, and that is also piracy, and something that the Caribbean has faced. I think it was Jamaica, also the Cayman Islands had medical supplies intercepted by the US at the beginning of the pandemic. The medical missions have been threatened by Marco Rubio, et cetera, by claiming that they're a form of enslaved labor. Ridiculous, but a show of what they think of the principle of solidarity and unity. but this is something that the whole Caribbean has experienced. The U.S. really getting in the way of their just trying to get basic needs to their people. Also, the targeted campaign against Venezuela, which has been such an essential part of integrationism in the Caribbean and access to oil for these islands that were fragmented by colonialism, that largely have economies that were set up to just extract and send to the north. Also in a process of decolonization, many of them also dealing with neoliberalism and how structural adjustment has attacked their healthcare systems. So just the notion that it is, the Cuban people's fault that they don't have access to these supplies, or that their way of the way that they've decided to organize their society is why there are these shortages, is really ludicrous. And we see it every day in terms of how people practice solidarity with each other, but also just how structurally, in terms of food distribution on the island, despite these attacks, in terms of dentists on almost, in every neighborhood, the pesquisas, I'm not sure Justin talked about that, but the students going door to door, the medical professionals knowing where people live. I got my first shot of Abdallah today, and when I was waiting in observation after getting my shot, it just such a beautiful, fruit of the Cuban Revolution, of their maroon struggles, the anti-slavery struggles. The doctors and nurses who were in the vacunatorio were all talking about who hadn't showed up yet, because most people are on their second or third dose at this point, with over 7.5 million doses administered on the island. And they were able to name people by like so-and-so and their mom. And what about the one on this street? I don't think he's come yet. Yeah, let me check. I mean, just such a beautiful rollout when you think about the US or anywhere else where it's been these like mega corporations that have made a killing, billions of dollars off of what was really a genocidal response to COVID, for which our people have paid the highest price. It's just so beautiful to see this alternative. And certainly, this SOS Cuba campaign is targeted at a moment when there's a lot of pressure on Biden to repeal Trump's sanctions, to repeal the blockade, and also where there's a lot of pressure because the whole world is aware of Cuba saving lives and, committing to medical international solidarity and also the well-being of the people. So it's definitely not coincidental, the timing of this attack and mischaracterization of the COVID response. Yeah, I got that. So exciting. And Cuba also participated in vaccination in Burkina Faso under Sankara. Cuba has sent medical brigades across the globe during Ebola to Western Africa, where the U.S. was just caring about how to protect itself, which was really just its business interests. Most of my friends here are students from the African continent, while many countries, actually many, build their migration laws to bring in white people and colonizers. Here in Cuba, you see Black folks, you see Palestinians, you see Nicaraguenses, on the bus, they're studying medicine. And, this is all a part of their medical system, from, the grassroots to the international.
In terms of public safety, so the Cuban president, along with the Cuban foreign minister, has accused the United States of being behind, the protests on July 11th, saying that, one of the key features of the Cuban Revolution is the fact that, they've been able to accomplish excellent public safety. In fact, it's I think it's without question, Cuba is the safest country in the entire hemisphere in terms of public safety. And so in terms of, waging this Twitter campaign, which was created, according to the Cuban foreign minister, which was created in Florida with a company based out in Florida. It was a way to disrupt, this one of the key characteristics of the Cuban Revolution, which is public safety. So couple things: is it as safe as everybody says? And what is it looking like now? After July 11th, did people protest the following day? Are protests still happening? What's it looking like now?
And also before you answer, Pambana and Justin, I think we want to emphasize, we're posing like we're talking about famine and we're talking about hunger, and we want to paint a picture because we know there's a lot of propaganda, but we know that there are difficulties in Cuba, and we want to present. We are socialists, but we don't want to be dogmatic and act like Cuba's perfect, and because that's not good either for anybody. Because if people go to Cuba and see that the reality is that Cuba isn't a paradise, actually, the working class people still do struggle. But we want to paint a more realistic picture and also explain, obviously, the root causes of stuff. So that's why we want to, we're asking these questions because we know that, sometimes the left act like Cuba is perfect, but we do want to paint a fuller picture, a more realistic picture.
Yeah, that's great to know, because it's good to know who we're talking to. That there should be unequivocal defense of the Cuban people and their revolutionary process, unequivocal rejection of the U.S. blockade, military occupation of Guantanamo Bay, of U.S. interventionism in the tens of millions, complex. But in terms of like what life is like, people are really shook about what has been going on. About the protests and the protests for the revolution, the protests that were criticizing the government and how things are being handled, as well as people who are just expressing frustrations at not being able to meet their basic needs. So safety definitely is a really important piece of a society that's built around taking care of each other and committing to each other. And I see that. I moved here to Havana from New Orleans, where the attack on the Black working class has just been so militarized and aggressive. And you can tell from just how the violence is from the state is just so intense. But people are really like stunned by the protests on Sunday and those that have gone on, since across the country, not just in Havana. There were acts of interpersonal violence, and it was really ugly for people to see. And there's a lot of worry. Also, folks saw the police, were manhandling or roughing people up. Many of the reports of police killing people or breaking down doors brutally have been exposed as false images in other places and videos in other places. But there definitely has been the internet being cut off except for in public Wi-Fi parks. I haven't heard people mention that a lot. When you go to the public Wi-Fi park, you can still connect with a Nauta account, but you do need a VPN to access instant messaging apps. And that's changed over the course of the days. Sometimes there has been, sometimes there hasn't. So things are, it's the government says this is a response to the social media campaign, the bots with their 5 messages a second, and, all of that. But it is alarming for people who want to use their phones for good things or to communicate with family and friends. So it's a really troubling time. And it's also a troubling time because Cubans know very well the lengths that the US will go to disrupt their well-being and to attack and terrorize peoples across the globe. So I think, public safety is also a question about, what is the US going to do next? And Carlos, as you said, this is certainly not about Cuba being a paradise. But in this last year and a half, where we've witnessed what capitalism is willing to do to create people, create disposability of people, we're seeing something different. But also things are hard. There are internal contradictions, there are class contradictions, there are aspirations not yet achieved. People have frustrations. People feel, that they are not integrated enough. But that's shared kind of across the globe. It's certainly not something that's unique to Cuba. I don't know what your question was. But yes, of course, there are challenges. The best way for a people to determine their destiny and to, engage in principled struggle is without U.S. intervention, and certainly without the U.S. threatening military incursion. I mean, it's just unforgivably genocidal.
Can either you, Pambana or Justin, speak to what are the streets looking like now? Are things back to normal? What's it looking like now?
Yeah, I mean, so I can take that one on Monday morning. My housemate here and I actually, this was after Sunday, and at this point, maybe some folks had data, maybe some folks didn't. But I was receiving international calls from my family, who were reading the media there, watching the news there, and and were calling me, as if it was like a war zone here or something like that. But I went around the whole city, and the situation was pretty calm and pretty normal. I think that's how it continues to be. I think there have been some small conflicts here and there. In my neighborhood on Tuesday, there was a report of people getting into small conflicts with with medical professionals. That again, this is being are things that are being instigated from outside. But outside of that, it's been fairly calm throughout the whole city.
Comrades Nick and Carlos, you want to have any follow-ups to that, or?
No, I mean, a lot of it is propaganda, and it reminds me a lot of the, there's a few, I want to say, tactics that a lot of the media propaganda does here in the U.S. There's exaggeration, there's distortion, and there's omission. A lot of what often occurs is exaggeration, exaggerating what is actually happening on the ground, and I've seen this multiple times in a few different places. I remember being in Vietnam maybe 2 years ago. There were some protests against China, and in Hanoi, when I was in that city at the same time. And if you know Hanoi, it's a huge city. It's very similar to New York City, very dense. And I get a call from my family, and they say, "Have you seen the coverage, the media on these protests in Vietnam and how how crazy they are?" It turns out it was just a few hundred people. I never even heard about it. I didn't see anything about it. There was no coverage about it. There was nothing. It was insignificant. And so I think a lot of that, that's just an analogy for a lot of what we're seeing now in Cuba. A lot of the original protests, they were, I call them, or I refer to them, they were large relative to previous anti-government protests in Cuba. And I think that was what was so shocking and stunning to people. And one thing I would ask Pambana as a follow-up is kind of what were people specifically stunned by or shocked by? What was it like? Was it the characteristic of these protests? Was it something about the people involved? Was it the size? What exactly was the shocking or stunning moment? Or maybe it was the response by the government.
At least from what I've heard, so one, you mentioned, these were some of the biggest mobilizations in past decades. Let's not forget mobilizations against colonialism and mass movements against Batista. But I think the size, but I think also just the vitriolic hatred that was apparent. I'm not saying that it was the predominant energy, but certainly, some people have made clear that the right wing in Cuba, not in Cuba, in Miami, Cuban Americans in Miami, are the children of plantation owners, the children of factories and lands that were nationalized. And there's a lot of like vitriolic hatred and racism that is coming from counter-revolutionary forces. And that's always alarming. I think particularly for people, those of us who don't share in racism and hatred for other humans, seeing that level of hatred kind of seep in. But I think that was largely seen on social media, and people seeing that probably as part of the mediatic war and the Twitter campaigns, etc. So I've heard a lot of people express being stunned by that.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say that it's also important to to place the protest within historic and regional context. For example, like in what country do we know of in recent memory where there have been protests, there have been demonstrations, and the president has shown up in person to talk to people on the street. Like President Díaz-Canel did in San Antonio de los Baños, where the first protest was. And in what country will there be a mass demonstration or a protest, and the next couple of days, all of the officials who have to do with any of the frustrations or any of the demands that protesters were making, are speaking on what was being said and responding to and explaining the situation, and showing internal numbers and internal graphs. As the president did, to show how they're responding to COVID, how they're trying to be as effective as possible in their response. And I think it's also important to, I think one of the phenomena that I've seen is how short the American memory can be, American imagination, and not thinking back to how the police, how the militarized response was against protesters and activists in Colombia, or in other places where we've seen recent demonstrations as well. So I think those are important things to make note of too.
Can I just add that yes, and the vitriolic hate is from the outside. That's it's not to say that people don't. It's very clear that this is like fomenting a really right-wing agenda where the majority of people are expressing frustrations not at that. They're not protesting against universalized health care or literacy campaigns or free education from daycare to university. They're protesting against conditions that are really difficult, that have not been alleviated enough. And the best way to alleviate them is with blockade. But yes, as Justin said, the hypocrisy is phenomenal. In Florida, there were quote unquote protests from right wingers. Among them many MAGA hats and Trump flags, and they have not witnessed the repression that DeSantis and Rubio and co are targeting members of racial justice movements, for Black Lives, targeting people who legally are tearing down statues of colonizers. And I think it is important also for people to keep in mind that this is a country whose constitution has been written by the people, whose government is not the children's children of slave owners. It's a country whose when Justin's talking about on the news, these politicians are going through like, this is how we decide how much is spent on hotels. This is how much we decide how much electricity. This is where we've had a difficulty in accessing electricity. Really answering questions that have arisen, like how are you deciding how the budget is spent to ensure that we are getting what we need? That's because they're the people. The government is the people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to piggyback off of what Pambana said, because and I'm sure she can attest to this too. A lot of the folks we spoke to, even folks who had I don't even want to say criticisms, but they had concerns about their material conditions and really the poverty that they were living in. Even those folks did not ever want to see the overthrow of the government. They didn't advocate for the overthrow of the government. They still identified, you know, a good amount still identified as proud Cubans, right? They're still identified as with the nation. They had some concerns. They wanted to see their lives get better, but it wasn't this desire to kill or destroy or burn or take anything down. It was a desire to move things in a more progressive and beneficial way for themselves and their families. That's a more legitimate desire. And oftentimes when people have these legitimate concerns, and really like you said, concerns really that are rooted in a financial blockade that costs Cuba billions of dollars each year, according to their own economists, with those legitimate concerns get exaggerated or get taken advantage of or manipulated by, you know, the US and other Western countries, and are used to try to burn down and destroy whole nations and whole governments. I mean, we saw that happen in Syria. And, you know, they're going to try to do the same thing in Bolivia and in Venezuela. And hopefully Cuba, and, you know, what they hope is they'll hope to do the same thing in Cuba. But, you know, the difference I would say with Cuba is that they have this revolutionary historical legacy where it's rooted in the culture and the minds of the people, that the revolution is meaningful to them, that it has brought a material advantage, and that it is to their advantage to stick with that revolutionary culture than to give up and you know, feed into whatever U.S. capitalist desires you know, has in mind for the Cuban nation. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there. You guys have any more questions?
I got a question for Carlito. Carlito, so you're like a year or two older than us. You've been around. you've been around for a little while. So you've seen a lot of plays off of the imperialist playbook. So your thoughts on what took place on July 11th and the
I'm not your ancestor yet, okay? When I become your ancestor, then we got something to talk about.
But your thoughts on what took place, the significance of it taking place now, and the response of the Cuban president and the Cuban people. I mean, you know, look, let's be clear. He said he was very defiant and said we're going to defend this revolution, and he called them revolutionaries and communists to take to the streets. And because this, again, it was obvious. It's obvious what was happening on July 11th, and it was a clear attack on the sovereignty of the nation of Cuba. And so your thoughts on that. Again, we've seen a lot over the years, and so your response to that.
Well, first and foremost, I got to say that Diaz is a gangster. Okay, he's a G, a real G. Okay, because he did something that no president has ever done, and that is he went to the heart of the trouble. He went right there into the streets. Okay, and his defiance it demonstrated conviction. Okay, but conviction with love for his people. Okay, and that's important because that's precisely what the Young Lords would have done. Okay, or the Black Panther Party, they would have gone right to the heart of the trouble. There's a lot of ways to look at this. Okay, for its face value, it has a demoralizing quality, not just for the Cuban people, but for people who support Cuba in all corners of the third world, including here in New York, in the Black and Latino community in particular. However, the thing that we have to feel good about, because I always resort to the art of war whenever there's a conflict like this, because in the art of war, you learn that your enemy is only as strong as he looks, because there is a side to the enemy that most people never take into consideration, and that is what is going on in the rear. There is a political crisis taking place right now in the United States, there is a war going on within the ruling class. Okay, within the ruling class. When they start talking about engaging in civil war amongst themselves, you know that they got problems. And that has never happened before in United States history, other than during the middle of the 1800s, prior to and during the American Civil War. Okay, there is a crisis that that no one should ever underestimate. I believe that this OSS bullshit is gonna fly by like a fart in the wind. Excuse my French, okay? You know, because this thing makes me very upset. What is happening is that U.S. imperialism, because it has this internal crisis going on, and it's very sharp, they need a distraction. Okay, they need a distraction, and they thought that they had that possibility with Cuba, but as many have seen in the international media, the U.S. is now falling on its own sword because the propaganda started backfiring, such as Raul Castro getting on a plane and flying to Venezuela to escape the crowd. Okay, the interior minister of Cuba resigning. Okay, that was also revealed to be false. You know, so the ruling class of the United States is falling on its own sword regarding this crisis. You know, so I have a lot of confidence that this crisis is going to pass. You know, and it's going to be beneficial for the Cuban people, but it also becomes a challenge for us living here in the United States, because we definitely have to up the ante in regards to the solidarity work with Cuba. You know, it should be, should serve like a wake-up call for all progressive and revolutionary forces in the United States, that we have to change our tactics, because what happened on Sunday, July 11th, was in some sense a new tactic that they used, using the technology of Twitter. Okay, so it means, it has implications for the Cuban people, but it also has implication for progressive and revolutionary forces inside of the imperialist bastion, the United States.
Well put. Well put. Pambana and Justin, would you like to respond at all to what Carlito just said? I'm curious to hear your perspective from what, in terms of a response to what he just said.
Yes, I think we have to study this moment and what this moment means. Certainly there's been an outpouring of support for the end of the blockade and in general for Cuban sovereignty. 184 countries have voted yet again for the blockade to be lifted at the UN just a few weeks ago. Cuba having these brigades all over the world, having really enviable infant mortality, maternal mortality, health outcomes, COVID response, having these 5 vaccines in development, 2 of them being used in the midst of a vaccine apartheid. This was timed particularly. It was also timed after there's been an upsurge of condemnation of Biden's, inaction. He had said on the campaign trail that he would, amongst many lies that are spewed, but hopefully this one will become realized. He said that he would repeal the sanctions that Trump had put in place He has not done that. People, had planned for that to happen. I mean, at least remittances. We all know how important remittances are for our families. So recently Blinken said that he was going to, they're reviewing the Cuba policy. Sakis said that, they'll definitely take into account these protests as they do that. And they don't mean the protests that were, with July 26 flags and the Cuban flag. So it is worrying in terms of this moment. Also, in the U.S., there has been a growing clarity on U.S. interventionism. We would hope for all of our work, knocking on doors, doing talleres, talking to people, workshops, webinars this year, revealing how evil capitalism is and racism is. Specifically in Haiti, the role of the U.S. has become illuminated greatly. The U.S.'s role since Haiti declared itself anti-slavery, abolitionist, and free in 1804, and certainly since 2004, when the U.S., Canada, France, and the UN orchestrated a coup against democratically elected Aristide, who had just declared reparations among land reform, building schools, clinics, etc. So there's, people are gaining clarity. We're winning hearts and minds when it comes to the role of the U.S. in destabilizing and attempting to recolonize. In Venezuela, the right that had been clamoring for sanctions. I mean, how people can do that is sickening when it comes to the global South, not white supremacist states. Because the COVAX purchase was intercepted because of U.S. sanctions, the right wing in Venezuela was embarrassed because it became very clear that then lobbying for sanctions equals more deaths. It was a very clear equation. So we're at this turning point of this moment in which people, in Bolivia, at a pace that is unparalleled, they're holding to account coup plotters, coup regime that massacred people in Sencata, in Sacaba and Ove Julio, that were deeply misogynist, racist, anti-indigenous. There's just this incredible moment of grassroots movements having clarity on the U.S. empire's need to fall. And so it makes sense that they, in these gasps, are carrying out these really horrific crimes against our people. So yes, we have to study this moment seriously. And as you say, we need to be more determined as ever, work harder, be more clear on what our aspirations are as a people, so that the majorities can benefit and the planet can survive the doom that has been imposed upon us.
Yeah,
real quick, I wanted to to go off what one of the things Carlito said in terms of this being like a distraction about what's going on here in the U.S. I saw a video yesterday at NBC. They of the building that collapsed in Miami. Mm-hmm. Over 100 people dead, and instead of protesting the fact that we allow these landlords and these folks who own these high rises to just get away with creating shitty infrastructure and not doing any upkeep, the Miami Cubans are out there protesting what's going on in Cuba instead of being mad at their own government. There are reports coming out that there's going to be a spike in cases of COVID cases here in the States, and that's going to lead to a spike in deaths. Yeah. No one's talking about that. No one's protesting about that. Why are we missing out on these vaccine rates? Well, the vaccine rate's 40%. We're trying to get it to what, like 70, 90%, right? There's the increase. There's still high jobless claims. People are still unemployed, right? People are still walking out on jobs because they're not getting paid enough. There's all these problems here in the U.S., and they all of a sudden just seem to disappear because now everyone's focused on Cuba and the humanitarian crisis on Cuba. We haven't even fixed anything that's going on right here in our own communities. We have people who are there's about to be mass evictions and a mass wave of homelessness here in the States. And now everyone's concerned with what's happening in Cuba. It's crazy to me because it's like, well, where are your priorities? You don't even care. You're talking about caring about people who live in some other country. You don't even care about your neighbors, right? So it's not only, it's crazy to me because it's hypocritical, and it really just exposes the bullshit that a lot of these people have underneath this veil of actually caring, or this veil of social justice. They don't care about people.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, and you know, following from what Pambana was saying, in terms of studying the moment, studying the situation, we tend to, well, you know, us as anti-conquista, I guess we always try and highlight Cuba, and Cuba is always represented by us Latin American socialists, you know, a kind of ideal, a hope that, you know, the rest of the region could follow in their example. But there is a lack in general. Like I think in terms of, you know, why react? Why is Cuba only now trending, and why are we talking about Cuba now when really we should be talking about Cuba all the time? You know, trying to study it all the time instead of just reacting, especially reacting to, you know, a moment like this where it's you know, really Cuba is on the defense. And then also, yeah, I also wanted to know and ask Justin and Pambana, why is it on social media? Why is it that it's young Cuban musicians or people related to the music industry that are so prominent in right-wing propaganda, right-wing circles? You know what? Yeah, it's just something, I guess, that baffles us a little bit. I think Nick was telling us about this guy who does videos for like 9 hours, 10 hours straight, which is baffling because, you know, having a 9 hour or 10 hour live stream in Cuba is probably very difficult. But yeah, and he's like, I don't know, what does he do exactly, Nick? He's like a propagandist, or?
Basically a propagandist. He actually, I was looking at some of his stuff today. He's based in Miami. He's with this like rap group, and he's like this white dude, and everyone else is black. And he, you know, he literally just shows videos, images, pictures, all this shit of what's been going on in terms of the protests. He's been doing this for the last 4 days, and it's these 10-hour live streams. People give him money. You know, it's a little out of the ordinary because none of his other work has ever received this much popularity as it's getting right now. And so it's, you know, it's very again, this is just my thinking, my opinion, but it seems not coincidental, you know, how rapidly he's able to grow, how rapidly he's able to gain a following, and a large following at that. But yeah, he's part of that. He's part of that hip hop scene that's feeding into this counter revolutionary culture. And he has videos and images of himself. And like I said, he's based in Miami. He has images and videos of himself going to Cuba, meeting with some folks, and you know, just talking with them, doing music with them, or whatever. So who knows what's going on behind the scenes? But this is something that's getting big, and it's not just musicians. You know, I saw some folks like this on my own trip. It's also, you know, some artists, different people who are engaged in culture. It is interesting. It would be nice to have more clarity on what exactly is going on there. I know the Cuban government has put out some statements too, about this sort of new trend.
Carlos, if I may, if people can recall, about 10 years ago, there were a number of hip hop artists that were scrutinized by Cuban intelligence because they were using that platform to galvanize an anti-government movement, and this happened like 10 years ago. But laying out what the brother just said about anyone involving with culture and religion, okay? I got nothing against religious people, but you know, although I'm an atheist, okay, there's a lot of trips There's a lot of trips that are given permission by the US government and make it easy for them to travel to Cuba. Okay, so long as they are involved in the realm of culture and religion. Okay, I have a friend whose mother doesn't support the Cuban government at all, but she's religious and her congregation frequently travels to Cuba. Okay, now you're not going to tell me that there's some mischief that goes on with these trips, okay, that are given legitimacy to travel, and this is part of the dilemma that the Cuban Revolution has been going through for several decades, where on the one hand they want these international connections, but on the other hand, imperialism utilizes those venues to funnel their counter-revolutionary deeds.
Yeah, and and just to add to that, I think something Pambana first said about really the importance of study, and I think it's something that Nick and Carlos have added on to as well. But I think I think it's hard in progressive and leftist communities to really fully blame people for if they get misled, if they misinterpret what's going on. I think the U.S. throws tens of millions of dollars at these subversive media campaigns, and what they specifically do is they weaponize the language that gets used in progressive communities, in leftist communities. They turn it into a moral dilemma. They say, how can you support Cuba when they have so much police brutality happening during these protests? So they really sort of place you in the situation where they weaponize your own values against you, taking away the lens of, how heavy of a hand they have in, the day-to-day situation and the challenges that are happening on the ground. So I think that's really important for people to, take this as an example to understand how deep, the US's, sabotage will go, to try to get people to not be in solidarity. So I think that's a really important thing for people to make note of and to really analyze right now, because I think that's only something that we'll continue to see.
Yeah, I similarly think the question is really, for those of us who are in movement and in solidarity, like, what do we do about this? And I think it's being really intentional about building ties between cultural workers who are rooted in a movement to change material conditions, to change the ways our societies are built, cultural work that is revolutionary, cultural work that is anti-colonial, that thinks through social, political, and economic rights and collective, not only individual rights. And so, that's kind of our task. I think there's also some really targeted, misinformation, disinformation to us as Black folks. We've heard, and I'm sure Carlito has heard for many years, that Cuba is racist. We also hear Cuba is homophobic. Cuba is not, doesn't treat artists well. There isn't freedom to express yourself. These are all really lies, particularly if they're comparable, if we're comparing, if we're rooting in regional realities in terms of what's been achieved by the majorities who are mostly Black, African descendant, who are mostly working class, poor global South people, who are incredibly creative in having, in all this mud, imagined an alternative path and are building it and defending it. So I think the task, I'm not an artist. I'm also not a journalist. I'm organizing for solidarity and internationalism. And so it's more like, what do we do? How do we get more artists to build with artists in Cuba in a way that's like really about solidarity, that's about walking together, that's about accompanying the struggle that needs to survive.
Yeah, and you know, and I would add that, you know, those are great points. Like, what do we do? What do we do about it? And you know, we always, I think we always say that we don't give ourselves Anticonquista enough credit as to the things we do. And one of the things that we have done in Colombia, for example, is funded a group of ex-guerrilla fighters who opened up, who were looking to open up a place called La Casa de la Paz, the House of Peace in Bogota. And we, with Anticonquista and our sister organization Red Condor, have given them about $10,000 for that project, and they recently opened it, and it's really that kind of basically the same kind of thing that those imperialist culture programs do, but in reverse. You know, funding these organizations. The Casa de la Paz today is a place where artists and campesinos come from outside of Bogota to go and sell their products at La Casa de la Paz. And it's really just a cultural space for progressive people, for lefties, for socialists, and yeah, and that's the kind of thing that we need to do and kind of replicate all over. And yeah, that's kind of like the mission or the objective of Anticonquista is to do that kind of work all over Latin America, including Cuba. And you know, we hope that now with the current situation, we can focus as a diaspora, as a Latin American diaspora, focus on how to counter the cultural imperialism, I guess you could call it, the cultural imperialism that it occurs on the island, as well as in Miami and the diaspora in general. So yeah, that's definitely something we need to think about.
And sorry for jumping on. Also, Carlito brought up religion and religious fundamentalism and right-wing evangelicals. You know, we, Justin and I, with the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective, partner with the Centro Memorial Martin Luther King, and they're folks who come out of liberation theology. They train in popular education. They are, you know, Christian and socialist and dedicated to, you know, protagonism in Cuba's revolution. They also carry out immense programs of solidarity. They're like a movement strategy center for the Americas, Abya Yala, and also work with us in the work against the blockade and to challenge U.S. imperialism. And right now they're doing this incredible work on the Código de la Familia, and work to challenge, you know, part of the Jornada en contra de la homofobia y la transfobia, work to challenge the right-wing elements that are, you know, deeply racist, deeply capitalist, deeply homophobic, transphobic, you know, and they're doing that as a center that's a religious center. You know, so for folks who do that kind of work, it's really important to build those ties that are rooted in ensuring dignity for the poor.
And two, I just wanted to highlight how some of the ways that we've seen right now they're manipulating some of our own movements in order to draw this similarity to what's going on in Cuba. So I think the easiest thing to point to is what was the most trending hashtag, or what was the most trending phrase that we've seen go around? SOS Cuba. And people have conflated this SOS Cuba with other things like SOS Colombia, right? Now we know Colombia is this narco trafficking, fascist, you know, ultra right-wing dictatorial state where paramilitaries running around killing social activists almost every week. When you put SOS Colombia and then SOS Cuba, you're conflating the two governments to basically be this, oh, well, both governments are these narco trafficking authoritarian states that are oppressing their people. And it's very easy to do that, right? All you got to do is put out this one hashtag and look, it's the same as this other one. It is these very subtle tactics that the imperialists use that kind of fly under the radar. And I like that one of the things Justin mentioned was, it's not a lot of the people, what we got to understand is, and from what I've seen personally, is I know a lot of people who are sharing these things about Cuba, like sharing this propaganda and all this kind of BS. And they're not the ultra right wing They're not even conservative. They consider themselves to be progressive, like social justice types of folks. And look, they're wrong. They're misguided, but I think they do have good intentions. And it's a matter of how do we win those folks back over from this sort of, hard, because this is a hard right propaganda campaign, but they don't even recognize that. How do we win them over from that in a way where they recognize and can dispel a lot of the lies and the propaganda that's been fed to them using this social justice kind of veil? I think that's a lot where a lot of the heavy work comes in. That's where a lot of the hard work comes in, and that's what we're trying to do, because it's not the same. You need to take these things. You need to take each one of these things in the very specific social context. And what's interesting too is a lot of people are talking about Cuba and Haiti, because we see now there's going to be mass protests probably in Haiti. There already are. Serious repression is going to occur. But let me ask you, where's the SOS Haiti hashtag? I haven't seen that go around. I haven't seen that get popularized. I don't see anyone saying SOS Haiti. Haiti needs help. I've seen people say, "Oh, Haiti, pay attention to Haiti. Let's focus on Haiti." I don't see anyone saying, "Oh, we gotta start bombing the country. We gotta start overthrowing the government." No one has said that, right? Because at the end of the day, the U.S. is gonna let Haiti fight amongst itself. They're backing people on both sides of this power move, of this imperialist power move by the ultra right wing. And we did our program on Haiti. You could check that out. But we show that it's a power play between two factions of the right wing party, both backed by the U.S. And the U.S. is going to let them fight it out. And who's going to be the casualties? Who's going to die from that? It's going to be the innocent civilians. But there's not a single trending hashtag here in the U.S. that's like SOS Haiti. We need to stop the incoming civil war that's going to occur. No one's saying that, right? And I think that's intentional. I think that's it is no way that's just a coincidence. That's intentional. A lot of what we're seeing that's been fabricated right now is intentional, right? So I think it's important to pay attention to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and and I would say, Nick, just to sort of like personalize some of the dynamics you were saying. Like I've had people, in my life, like share some of the same things that you're talking about on social media that are misguided, that are manipulations of the truth, who have been here, who have like spent months studying here, and are still like sabotaged by this, just to show the strength of it, and I guess another example to personalize it is, I was at my teacher's house here, my teacher who teaches on the history of slavery in Cuba, and I was talking to her son who lives in Norway and has really been radicalized while being there in a conservative way, and we're trying to coordinate, again, it's my teacher who needs the medicine for her nerve. We're trying to coordinate how to get it to me in the US from Mexico. So I was going to send him my address, and he didn't believe that we had internet, until I actually called him over WhatsApp. He was so convinced that the internet was still, was fully shut off. There was no way to access it. Until I physically actually send him a message over WhatsApp. Again, just to show some personal examples between how strong these disinformation campaigns are.
Mm-hmm. So, folks, we need to wrap up here. I appreciate the guests, all of you. We're going on an hour and 13 minutes. It's 6:22 p.m. I know, Pambana, you're limited. I believe Justin as well. Carlito, I know you had to go and as well. So let's sort of wrap up here. I want to say a few things, for folks, especially for folks who may be listening to a program like this for the first time. Please study the empire, study our own history. I've said this, on prior programs, and we're essentially like this rogue criminal genocidal state. I mean, go just study our history in Cambodia, in Laos, in Libya, in Iraq, Iran, in Vietnam. What we've done to Cuba for just creating, as the sister said, a different model, a different political and economic model since the beginning. It's been economic warfare. It's been CIA assassination attempts on its leaders. It's tens of millions of dollars every single year to try to essentially foment a civil war in supporting opposition groups. It's just nonstop barrage of lies. I mean, it never stops. It never ceases. And so, Carlito, just can you wrap up? And then we'll also give the final word to the sister Pambana and Justin, just very quickly here, while we have about maybe less than 10 minutes.
Well, I'm going to take Nick's advice, and I'm going to go now and create an SOS Puerto Rico. okay? Because, we were invaded. We were invaded and colonized along with Cuba, okay? And to all of those idiots that are following that call of SOS Cuba, why don't you take a trip over to Puerto Rico, okay? And so that you can see the virtues of colonialism. Is that what you want for your homeland? Okay, that's the question I have for those that are that are thinking with their rear end. Okay, the other thing that I want to say is that let the situation that occurred this week in Cuba be a lesson to the revolutionaries in the United States, because it should be a reminder that the greatest act of solidarity that we can render Cuba is to cause revolution inside of the belly of the beast. That is, because we could talk solidarity, but there's solidarity and then there's solidarity. Okay. And if we are serious, and I'm speaking to those in the United States, that if you are, if we want to end the criminal blockade against a very humane, government, a humane country, and a very humane people, then we need to, weaken the reins of power of the imperialist bastion right here in the United States.
Justin, you want to go, and then we'll leave the last word from Pambana.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, going off of what Carlito said, my first thought is to sort of go through some of the solidarity actions that people can engage in at the moment. So starting off, there's a lot of, campaigns, there's a lot of work happening on the ground in the US, one of which is Carlos Lazo's Puentes de Amor, or Bridges of Love, which, and there's a caravan right now going from Miami, and it's going to end in DC on July 25th. Where people can show up to receive it there. They've been leading monthly caravans, everywhere across the U.S., internationally as well. Some examples of which include, there's a group of folks in Ireland that are walking 1 kilometer per every year of the blockade. So that's one solidarity action that people can engage in. In terms of one of the impacts of the blockade on the medical system here, Cuba was down about 20 million syringes, and there have been campaigns across the world. By Cuban communities living, abroad, by folks in the States to raise funds to, be able to buy syringes to send here, the cost of which has been dramatically going up as there's a shortage of it worldwide. So folks can donate to, to purchase syringes through global health partners, another solidarity action that people can engage in is, help to form a resolution at a city level, at a municipal level, within a union to, show support for ending the blockade, or to ask for medical collaboration with Cuba, who've developed a lot of really incredible, medical advances that would be so useful to folks in the U.S., one of which is a lung cancer vaccine. You can talk about their homeopathic medicines, such as Rovira, which has been heavily applied during the COVID-19 pandemic. And resolutions of those that have, some recent ones include the Minneapolis School Board. There was one in Chicago at the House of Representatives level. So, and those are gone as far to represent over 30 million people in the U.S. And those are some among a few others, and I'll pass it to Pambana for the rest of them and for the closing.
Hey, yeah, so sorry that I have to dip out, Justin, so I'll ask you to continue. My just parting words will be, the U.S. is always involved in these kinds of affairs, and always has been since its founding as the settler colony. And so it's important to study the U.S. empire, as Brother Victor said, and also to study the proposals of life, life with dignity, of buen vivir, the proposals from the Movimiento Socialismo, the proposals from the Bolivarian Revolution, certainly the proposals from the Haitian Revolution, 150 years before the Cuban Revolution. Never are disturbances, not political. There's always a war between empire and sovereignty, and Black and Indigenous autonomy and power. And so we should be studying what those before us have fought for, and be clear about that which is a threat to our communities. And thank you so much for opening the space. Thank you, Carlito, for your years.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we will end there. Down with U.S. imperialism. Long live the Cuban Revolution. We love all of our supporters. We appreciate the support. Carlito, thank you. Justin, thank you. Comrades Carlos and Nick. Palante.
Thank you, comrades. Take care.